Welcome back, everybody. This is episode 2 of my series in how to make pop music. So, in the first episode, we went over some of the basics of the Ableton interface, and then I just got you making some sounds. So today we're going to talk about audio effects. We're going to go over EQ, compression, and ambience. Now, I'm going to start just explaining these on a theoretical level, and then we're going to dive into Ableton and actually see them and how they operate. Let's start with EQ. Now, to understand EQ, we need to go back to some very basic stuff. Any sound, no matter what it is, contains frequencies. And EQ allows us to change the volume of specific frequencies in a sound. So rather than manipulating the volume of a track, which will affect all of the frequencies, EQ allows us to get in, boost certain frequencies, cut other frequencies. It's a precise tool, and it's probably the most important audio effect that we're going to talk about today. Okay, so why is EQ so important? Well, for a song to sound good, we don't want our different tracks competing too much within certain frequency ranges. Think of a song like a puzzle, and the tracks of a song like puzzle pieces. Audio effects, and EQ especially, allow us to get in, shape those edges of the puzzle pieces, and fine-tune everything so that they fit together. When everything fits together, a song sounds good. We can hear the vocal clearly, the drums hit hard, the guitars are full, and we achieve that in large part because of EQ. Compression does exactly what you'd think it does. It compresses or squashes a signal. We call that reducing the dynamic range of a sound. We take the highest parts and make them quieter, and we take the quietest parts and make them louder. Now, why is compression important? Well, for one, we want our song in the end to sound like one whole piece of music, and compression does that for us. It's also the hallmark sound of modern music. When applied to drums, compression gives us that punchy, huge feeling, and when it's applied to vocals, it gives us that nice, clear sound that we're used to hearing on the radio. Now, there's all sorts of different compressors that we'll talk about in another video, but for an example, saturation is a type of compression that adds a lot of character and warmth to a sound by bringing out what we call transients. Finally, we have ambience, and when I'm talking about ambience, I'm talking about reverb and delay. You know how when you yell in a cave, you hear a big echo, but when you yell in your room, you don't hear much? This is because of reverb, which is the lingering decay of a sound as it's bouncing off walls and coming back into our ears. Now, why is reverb important? Well, our brains are naturally used to hearing reverb all the time because we're always in different spaces. If there's no reverb, aka a completely dry signal, it just doesn't sound natural to us. When we record a dry signal through a microphone, for example, we often add reverb in the form of an audio effect in order to create a more natural feel. So reverb audio effects emulate different spaces that we can put our sound into. And there's all sorts of cool things we can do with reverb. It's not always about making something feel natural so that we don't notice it. It's a really pleasing sound that we can use in large quantities to create cool effects. The other type of ambience is delay, which is literally just repeating a signal back after a certain amount of time. It often sounds like reverb, but it is a different thing. Okay, so we've gone over the definitions of what these audio effects are. Let's jump into Ableton and see what they sound like. Okay, so we're here in Ableton, and I cooked up a little trap beat that we can start applying audio effects to. First, let's just take a listen. All right, we're leveling up the beats for episode 2. Here we go. So let's take a look at EQ, and I'm just going to apply it to this little brass thing in the intro. Going back to our categories bar on the left, here we have audio effects, and there's a bunch of different folders. There's all sorts of cool stuff. We're going to go to EQ and filters and drag an EQ8 onto our little brass thing. You can also just search for EQ in the search bar, and here it is. So here's the EQ down here. This is our audio effect chain. So when we add more audio effects, for example, another EQ, it's just going to create a chain and show up here. I'm going to click this arrow here and open it up so that we have a better view. Now, before I even do anything with this EQ, when I press play, we're going to see the frequency spectrum of this brass. Now, on the left side of the EQ are all of our low frequencies. In the middle, we have our mid frequencies, and on the right, we have our high frequencies. I'm throwing up a little graphic to show you more in-depth frequency range, as well as a link in the description to the different instruments and the ranges that they tend to fall in. This will be a really useful way to get started EQing things and knowing that you're making good moves. Now, these little yellow guys here are frequency bands. I can drag it up to boost these low frequencies. I can drag it down to reduce these low frequencies. And I can also go down here and change the shape so that I can just cut these frequencies all together, and we can do that on any of these bands. Now, I'm going to play the sound and manipulate the EQ so you can actually hear what it's doing. Okay, let's look at compression. So compression is going to be in this dynamics folder here, and we're going to just click and drag it onto our audio effect chain. And there's a lot of stuff going on here. Now, compression is probably a little bit harder to hear than EQ, but you will get used to it, and that doesn't mean that it's any less important. So there's a couple parameters I want to go over. First, on the bottom right, we have this dry-wet knob. This controls how much of the compressed signal you're hearing versus the signal without this compression. So if the dry wet's at 100, we're hearing 100% of the compression. If the dry wet's at 0, we're not hearing it at all. The threshold controls at what volume the compression actually starts kicking in. So if we drag this down further, there will be more compression applied. Now, the ratio knob controls how aggressive our compression is going to be. The higher the ratio, the more aggressive the compression will be, and the lower the ratio, the less aggressive it will be. The attack knob controls how fast that compression kicks in. So the longer the attack, the slower it will be. The shorter the attack, the faster it will be. The release controls how fast the compression kicks out or lets go. So a quick release time will mean that the compressor stops compressing really quickly, and a longer time will mean that it'll take longer to do that. Finally, this makeup button adds volume back into the signal after it's been compressed. And this is important because compression will often make a sound quieter. So here's the sound with the compression and without. Okay, let's move to reverb. So I'm going to go into this reverb folder and click and drag a reverb on. And I think you'll hear what reverb does right off the bat. So it makes it sound spacey. Now again, there are a couple parameters I want to go over. So again, we have this dry-wet knob, which controls how much of the reverb we're hearing. If we bring this dry-wet to 100, we're just going to hear the reverb signal. And if we bring it all the way down, we'll hear the signal without any reverb. Now that tail you're hearing in the reverb is all of those reflections bouncing and slowly dissipating. This decay knob here will determine how long it takes for those reflections to finally dissipate. So if we have a really long decay, we're going to have a long tail. And if we have a really short decay, those reflections will dissipate much faster. Okay, finally, let's look at a delay. So I'm going to this delay and loop folder, clicking and dragging in, and when we play it, we should hear it. So it's just repeating that signal back. Now again, we have a dry-wet knob where we can have just the delay playing, or none of it playing. We have this feedback knob, which determines how many echoes we actually hear. So the higher the feedback, the more echoes we'll hear, and the lower the feedback, the fewer echoes we'll hear. And then these numbers here determine the length of time it takes for that echo to play back. So it's set on 3 now. If we make it 2, it's going to be a bit of a shorter amount of time for that echo to play back. We also have this EQ-like filter here where we can filter the echoes that are coming in. And finally, we have this ping pong button. And when we select that, it's going to play the echoes in our left and right headphones, switching on and off. Okay, so we've gone over EQ, compression, and ambience, and we've heard kind of what they sound like, but how do we actually use them to make our song better? I'm going to take this beat now, which has no audio effects on it, and start adding in these tools, and we're going to see where it ends up. Okay, so this is how our beat starts. Let's EQ this sound a little bit. So you see all these low frequencies? We don't need any of these. So I'm going to select this first band and select this and cut it. And then I might boost this part because this is really where this sound shines and there's nothing it has to compete with. And I was kind of liking that delay, so I'm going to go back here, add this delay in, select 2. I'm going to bring the dry wet down to about 30, ping pong delay, and then I'm going to really filter this. Cool. Now I'm going to add some compression. So I'm going to bring this threshold down to about -15. I'm going to add the makeup gain, and I'm going to keep the ratio where it's at, bring the attack up a little bit, and the release up a little bit. And let's hear how that sounds. Now, one important thing is when you compress something, that can bring some of the lower frequencies back in. So I'm just going to take another EQ and cut those lows again. Okay, so let's look at these bells. I kind of like the dry sound. I'm going to throw on an EQ and a compressor. So again, I'm going to cut these lows. And then I'm going to really compress this. And I'm really just following my ear here. Okay, cool. So if I just solo these 2, this might be a little loud, so I'm just going to bring it down. Okay, let's check out this bass. So I'm going to solo it so you can hear it. Okay, so that could use some EQ and compression as well. So here's the EQ. I want this to be really fat, so I'm going to boost the low quite a bit. And I'm just going to bring down these mids because we don't really need them. Let's add some compression. Okay, I feel like this bass needs some color to it, so I'm going to search up saturation. And here we have our saturator. And I'm going to go in. One great thing about Ableton is there's all these preset audio effects, and I really like this crew cut one. It gives a really aggressive bass sound. Now, we're going to tone it back because it's a little aggressive, but just so you can hear it, I'll play it. So it sounds like a fart almost, but it's dope. So I'm going to bring this drive down to about there, and then I'm going to drag the dry wet down too. So if I turn this off by clicking the yellow button, this is what the bass sounded like before and with. So let's move to the drums. And this may look a little unfamiliar. It's because I have my drums in a group. Now, groups are important not only for organizational purposes, but also because sometimes we want to apply audio effects to an entire group of tracks as a whole. So I'm going to add some audio effects to these tracks individually, and then I'm going to use some group processing. So the first thing I'm hearing is these drums all need to be louder. So I'm just going to bring these back up. I'm going to bring them back up to 0, and then we'll work from there. Okay, so these hats are way too loud. Now I'm going to do a pretty sharp cut on this kick so that we're just getting that punch. Yeah, we don't really need these. But I do like this kind of high-end clicky part of the kick, so we're going to bring that up a little bit. Now this clap, we're going to EQ and compress this. So we don't need these low frequencies in the clap. I'm going to do a harsh cutoff right where that hit is. You can kind of see it in the frequency. And then I'm going to add some compression. Now I find that I like a really short release and an attack at about 25, anywhere 20 to 30. And I'm going to make this ratio like 7 or 8. Bring the threshold down. Bring the makeup on. And then we're going to bring this dry wet down. So that's with the compression. This is without. Just gives it a little more punch. Now we have this little effect riser thing. So there's really all we need from this riser is the really high frequencies. So I'm going to do a pretty aggressive cut, which we call a high pass, because we're passing the highs and we're cutting the lows. And I might just drag this band down just to give it kind of a hollow sound. Versus okay, so here's our main hat loop. As you can see, this has already been EQ'd because we have a pretty hard cutoff here and there's no lows happening. So this is honestly good. And this is probably a good learning example. If your track doesn't need an audio effect on it, don't just add one for the sake of adding it. For the longest time, I had effect chains that were way too long, and I found out that if I just took everything off, it sounded better. So do not add audio effects when you don't need them. This hat sounds good to me. I'm just going to leave it. So then we have these two rolls here. I really like how this one's sounding. It's kind of moving left to right. We'll talk about panning in another video. This one, I think we could add some delay. So I'm going to search for delay. Let's just mess around with these values. That's cool. Ping pong. Okay, so it's a little aggressive. I'm going to bring this feedback way down. So again, by bringing the feedback down, I'm just limiting the amount of echoes that are going to happen. And then I'm just going to drag this dry wet down. So it's a little less aggressive. Okay, cool. I'm going to solo this drum group here. bring this kick down a little. Let's maybe bring in the bass. Okay, this is cool. All I'm going to do on this group is I'm going to throw on an EQ. Just take a look. See, there's all these lows getting back in that I don't want, so I'm going to just cut it again. You hear how much punchier that makes the kick? And then I'm just going to bring down some of these highs a little bit just to let the bell sound shine. Okay, so everything's a lot bigger. This bell sound now is sounding a little too dry to me, so I might add just a little bit of reverb. See, that's already kind of cool. All right, let's take a listen to this beat and see what we think. Okay, so I heard two things. This brass, I'm not actually digging the delay as much as I thought. I think I really want a reverb. I'm going to keep the delay on, but just bring that dry wet way down. And I'm going to add some reverb. Okay, cool. And then the other thing I heard was this bass. I just want a little more grit, so I'm just going to bring up this drive. There we go. Okay, cool. So that's our beat. I honestly think this beat is hard. But I think that we did a good job of using these basic audio effects, just getting everything sounding bigger, making a little more room for things, and I think I'm going to leave it there. There are a couple moves I'd want to make to this beat, but that requires a new skill that deserves an entire video on its own, and that is automating audio effects. And so basically what that means is I can go back to this reverb, and I can go to this decay here on this brass, and make the decay really long in the beginning and then slowly fade out before that beat comes in. And so there's a way to do that so that you don't have to do it on the fly, but we will talk about that in another video. So I'm going to leave it here. I hope you learned something. Thank you so much for watching. As always, like and subscribe, and I'll see you next week.